How did Enlightenment thinking influence the Spanish treatment of Indians? If you're curious about how Enlightenment thinking affected the way Spanish colonizers treated indigenous peoples in the Americas, let's break it down. During the Age of Enlightenment, new ideas about reason, equality, and human rights were emerging in Europe. However, these ideas did not necessarily translate into better treatment of indigenous peoples by the Spanish. In the late 18th century, the Spanish Bourbons implemented various reforms that were supposed to reflect Enlightenment values. These reforms included policies aimed at peaceful coexistence and the slow integration of independent Indians into colonial society. For instance, the Spanish experimented with strategies to coexist peacefully with tribal peoples on their frontiers and borderlands. Despite these efforts, the reality on the ground was often very different. Power and economic interests frequently overshadowed the ideals of Enlightenment. In places where the Spanish wanted Indian land and had the means to take it, enlightened policies gave way to avarice, opportunism, and violence. This meant that many of the humane policies were not consistently enforced, and the treatment of indigenous peoples remained harsh. Historically, Spain had passed laws to protect indigenous peoples as early as 1512, such as the Laws of Burgos, which regulated the behavior of Europeans in the New World and prohibited the ill treatment of indigenous people. These laws were expanded and amended over time, like the New Laws of 1542, which aimed to prevent abuse and de facto enslavement of natives. However, these laws were not always followed, and the actual treatment of indigenous peoples often contradicted the spirit of these regulations. The influence of Enlightenment thinking was also reflected in the debates among Spanish intellectuals. Figures like Bartolome de las Casas argued passionately for the humane treatment of indigenous peoples, advocating for peaceful conversion to Christianity rather than force. On the other hand, others like Juan de Sepulveda justified the use of force and enslavement, arguing that the Indians were inferior and needed to be civilized. In practice, the Spanish treatment of Indians was marked by contradictions. While there were attempts to implement more humane policies, the dominant reality was one of exploitation, forced labor, and violence. The Black Legend, which describes the atrocities committed by Spanish colonizers, highlights the harsh conditions faced by indigenous peoples despite the theoretical underpinnings of Enlightenment thinking. So, while Enlightenment ideas did influence Spanish policies towards indigenous peoples, the actual treatment was often brutal and driven by power and economic interests rather than by the ideals of reason and equality.